The sun, a benevolent sovereign of the Suffolk sky, cast its honeyed light across the fields surrounding the village of Woolpit. It was the time of the reaping, a season of diligent labor and quiet satisfaction, when the very air seemed to hum with the promise of sustenance and the coming of a well-earned rest. The year was in its gentle decline, the days shortening with a soft, apologetic grace, and the shadows of the ancient oaks stretching long and languid across the shorn wheat fields. Woolpit was a place woven from the threads of tradition and the rhythms of the earth. Its name, in the old tongue, spoke of the wolf pits dug deep in the surrounding forests in ages past, a reminder of a wilder time. But now the wolves were specters of folklore, and the pits were but deep, moss-lined dimples in the landscape, softened by time and overgrown with ferns and trailing ivy. They were places of curiosity for children and of quiet avoidance for their elders, repositories of old stories and unspoken superstitions. Life in Woolpit moved with the certainty of the tide. The cocks crow at dawn, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the scent of baking bread from the communal oven, the murmur of prayer from the small stone church of St. Mary's. These were the sounds and smells that composed the symphony of a villager's day. It was a life of simple truths. The soil was honest, the rain was a blessing, and the sun was a gift from God. On this particular day, the last of the harvest was being brought in. The reapers, their backs bent in a posture of humble communion with the land, moved in a slow, sweeping dance across the remaining fields. Their scythes whispered through the dry stalks, a sound as ancient and soothing as the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. Among them were two men, Ewan, a man whose face was a road map of sun-wrinkled smiles, and Bryce, younger, quieter, his movements still learning the perfect economy of his elders. They worked near the edge of the Woolpit woods, where the cultivated land gave way to the untamed tangle of the forest. Here, the shadows were deeper, the air cooler, and the silence more profound. It was in this liminal space, between the world of man and the world of the wood, that the day's familiar rhythm was destined to be broken. As the midday sun reached its zenith, pausing for a moment as if to admire its own handiwork, the men stopped their labor for a crust of bread and a sip of cool water from a clay jug. It was in this sudden quiet, with the whisper of the scythes silenced, that they heard it, a sound, faint and sorrowful, drifting from the direction of the old wolf pit. It was not the cry of any animal they knew, nor was it the familiar sound of a lost child. It was a thin, ethereal wailing, a melody of pure distress that seemed to pull at the very air. Ewan and Bryce exchanged a look, a mixture of curiosity and a primal, ingrained caution. The woods held their own secrets, and it was not wise to pry too deeply. But the sound was persistent, a thread of sorrow that could not be ignored. "What devilry is that?" Bryce murmured, his hand instinctively going to the small wooden cross he wore around his neck. Ewan, older and less prone to thoughts of devils, simply squinted towards the trees. "It sounds like lambs, perhaps, but lost and frightened." They listened again. The sound was too articulate for a lamb, too musical for a fox cub. It had the shape of a human cry, yet the tone was utterly alien. Compelled by a shared, unspoken sense of duty, they laid down their bread, picked up their stout wooden staffs, and began to walk towards the source of the sound, their boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves and twigs. They moved cautiously, the dappled sunlight playing tricks on their eyes. The air grew stiller, heavy, with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The wailing grew louder, more distinct, and now they could discern two separate voices, intertwined in a lament of exquisite sadness. They followed the sound to the largest and oldest of the wolf pits, a great, shadowed bowl in the earth, its sides steep and slick with moss. Peering over the edge, their hearts gave a sudden, collective lurch. For a moment, they did not understand what they were seeing. Down at the bottom of the pit, huddled together like two frightened finches, were two children, a boy and a girl. They were small, delicately formed, and dressed in clothes of a strange, woven material and an unfamiliar cut. But it was not their attire that stole the breath from the reapers' lungs. It was their skin. Their skin, from the soles of their small feet to the tear-streaked skin of their faces, was the color of newly unfurled fern fronds. It was a soft, living green, not painted or stained, but seeming to emanate from within, as if their very blood ran with the sap of spring leaves. The girl's long hair was the color of pale corn silk, a stark contrast to her verdant skin, while the boy's was a shade darker, like damp straw. Their eyes, wide with terror and confusion, were a deep, almond-shaped shade of hazel, yet they too seemed to hold a strange, luminous quality. The children fell silent the moment they saw the faces of the men peering down at them. Their wailing ceased, replaced by a stunned, fearful stillness. They clung to each other, their green hands intertwined, their small bodies trembling. Ewan and Bryce were simple men, accustomed to the predictable palette of the English countryside, the brown of the soil, the gold of the wheat, the blue of the sky. This sudden, impossible splash of green in human form was a sight so beyond their comprehension that it bordered on the terrifying. For a long moment, they could only stare, their minds grappling with folklore and faith. Were they feyfolk, strayed from a fairy ring? Wood sprites, born of moss and shadow? Or something else entirely, something for which they had no name? But then Ewan saw the tears that traced clean paths down the girl's green cheeks, and the raw, human terror in the boy's eyes. Whatever they were children, and they were afraid. The farmer's instinct, an instinct to nurture and protect, overrode the fear of the unknown. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer and gentler than he knew he was capable of. He did not know if they could understand his words, but he hoped they could understand his tone. He held out an open hand, palm up, a gesture of peace. Bryce, recovering from his shock, nodded in agreement. He slid carefully down one of the less steep sides of the pit, the soft earth giving way under his boots. The children flinched back as he approached, pressing themselves against the damp wall of the pit. He stopped a few feet away, kneeling down so as not to tower over them. He offered them a small, reassuring smile. The language they spoke to each other was a soft, babbling burble, like a brook flowing over smooth stones. It was a cascade of liquid sounds and gentle clicks, utterly incomprehensible, yet filled with an undeniable urgency and fear. Slowly, patiently, the two reapers coaxed the children out of the pit. The boy was weak, stumbling often, and Ewan eventually lifted him into his strong arms. The child was light, almost weightless, and he trembled like a trapped bird. The girl followed close behind Bryce, her strange, luminous eyes darting about, taking in the overwhelming, sun-drenched world with a look of profound bewilderment. The light of the sun seemed to cause them discomfort. They squinted and shielded their eyes, as if accustomed to a much dimmer illumination. Wordlessly, the small, strange procession made its way back through the woods and across the shorn field, towards the familiar, comforting cluster of wattle and daub cottages that was the village of Woolpit. As they emerged from the tree line, other villagers stopped their work, their conversations falling silent. A ripple of astonishment and disbelief spread through the small community. People gathered, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and pity. The children, overwhelmed by the staring eyes and the bright, open spaces, began to weep again, their soft, alien cries echoing in the suddenly silent air. The news traveled swiftly, as news does in a small village, carried on the wings of wonder. It reached the manor house of Sir Richard de Cullen, the local knight and lord of the land, a man known for his stern justice, but also for his quiet piety and deep-seated compassion. He came out to the village green, his wife, the gentle Lady Alara, at his side. When Sir Richard saw the children, his stoic demeanor softened. He saw past the impossible color of their skin to the stark reality of their condition. They were lost, starving, and terrified. He looked at his wife, whose own eyes were filled with a profound and immediate sympathy, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were a good and kind couple, blessed with land and status, but not with children of their own. "Bring them to the house," Sir Richard commanded, his voice firm but gentle, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Give them shelter, and see that they are cared for." And so, the green children were led away from the curious, fearful gaze of the villagers, through the stone gate of the manor house, and into a world of bewildering strangeness. They were brought into the great hall, a vast, echoing space with a high, timbered ceiling and rushes strewn upon the floor. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and beeswax, scents as alien to them as their own appearance was to their hosts. Lady Alara herself, with the help of her most trusted servants, tended to the children. They tried to offer them food, warm, fresh-baked bread, slices of roasted pork, a bowl of rich pottage. But the children refused everything. They would turn their heads away, their small green faces puckered in disgust, and weep silently. They touched the food with their fingertips, sniffed it with a deep-seated revulsion, and pushed it away. For several days they ate nothing at all, and their small frames grew weaker, their green skin seeming to pale and lose its vibrancy. The boy, in particular, seemed to be fading, his eyes often closed, his breathing shallow. The household grew desperate. Sir Richard and his wife watched with aching hearts as the strange, beautiful children seemed to be starving themselves in a world of plenty. They tried milk, honey, cheese, fruits from the orchard. All were rejected. The children would only drink water, sipping it slowly from a wooden cup. It was a young kitchen maid who stumbled upon the solution. She had brought in a basket of freshly picked broad beans from the garden, their pods a vibrant, familiar green. As she was shelling them into a large wooden bowl, the two children, who had been sitting listlessly by the hearth, suddenly stirred, their heads lifted, their nostrils flared, and a look of intense, desperate longing came over their faces. The girl rose on unsteady feet and pointed a trembling green finger at the bowl. She spoke in her strange, liquid tongue, a torrent of eager, pleading sounds. The boy, too weak to stand, pushed himself up on his elbows, his weary eyes fixed on the beans. Seeing this, the kitchen maid, her heart pounding with the discovery, offered them a handful of the raw beans, still in their pods. The children seized them with a desperate eagerness. They did not shell them as the villagers did. Instead, they skillfully split the stalks with their fingers and seemed to suck the moisture and substance from within, ignoring the beans themselves. When they had exhausted the pods, they looked at the raw beans with a kind of confusion and sadness, as if they were an unfamiliar and disappointing part of the food. But they were nourished. For the first time since their arrival they had eaten. A great wave of relief washed over the household. From that day on, the children were fed a diet of raw beanstalks. The manor's gardens were scoured for them, and as the seasons turned and the fresh supply dwindled, they were given dried beans, which they would painstakingly soak in water. Slowly, very slowly, as they watched the people around them eat, they began to accustom themselves to other foods. The girl, ever the more curious and resilient one, was the first to try a piece of bread, chewing it tentatively, her expression one of profound concentration. In time, she would eat almost anything placed before her. The boy, however, never truly adapted. He remained frail and melancholic, a little green shadow flitting through the great stone house. He seemed to pine for something a world away, a longing in his eyes that no amount of kindness or comfort could soothe. He ate little besides his preferred beans, and grew steadily weaker as the days grew shorter and the cold of winter began to seep into the bones of the old manor. While the children's bodies were slowly being nourished, their minds were a mystery that Father Thomas, the village priest, was determined to unravel. He was a scholarly man, with a gentle soul and an insatiable curiosity about God's creation in all its varied forms. He saw the children not as portents or sprites, but as a divine puzzle, a testament to the boundless and mysterious nature of the world. He began to spend his afternoons with them, sitting on a low stool by the fire. At first, he would simply be present, a calm and reassuring figure in their strange new world. He would speak to them in a low, soothing voice, naming the objects around the room. "Fire," he would say, pointing to the dancing flames. "Wood, stone, cup, bread." The children would watch him, their heads cocked, their luminous eyes following his every gesture. For weeks they showed no sign of comprehension, responding only with their own soft, flowing language. But Father Thomas was patient. He repeated the words day after day, a gentle litany of their new reality. The girl was the first to break the silence. One afternoon, as Father Thomas held up a piece of bread, she looked at it, then at him, and whispered a single, perfectly formed word. "Bread." A smile of pure, unadulterated joy spread across the priest's face. It was a beginning. A key had been turned in a lock they had not known how to open. From that day forward, the girls' acquisition of their language was astonishingly swift. It was as if a dam had broken. and the words of the Anglo-Norman tongue flowed into her mind. She absorbed new words like a thirsty sponge, her pronunciation still tinged with the musical cadence of her own language, but her meaning becoming clearer each day. She was given a name, Agnes, a common and sturdy name of the land, and she seemed to accept it with a quiet grace. The boy, whose frailty seemed to deepen with each passing day, never learned to speak their tongue. He would listen as his sister and the priest talked, a look of profound sadness in his eyes, but he remained locked in his silent world, communicating only with his sister in their native, babbling speech. He seemed to be withering in the bright sunlight of this world, a cutting taken from a twilight plant that could not root in foreign soil. As winter tightened its grip on Woolpit, blanketing the fields in a shroud of white, the boy's health failed completely. He succumbed to a sickness that left him weak and breathless. Lady Alara nursed him with a desperate tenderness, but it was no use. One cold, clear morning, as the low winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was buried in the consecrated ground of the churchyard, a small, plain wooden cross marking his grave. The entire village mourned the little green boy, this gentle, sorrowful mystery who had lived among them for a season and then departed. His sister, Agnes, wept for him with a grief that was deep and silent, a sorrow that seemed to resonate with the quiet, frozen landscape. After her brother's death, Agnes clung even more tightly to her new family, Sir Richard, Lady Alara, and Father Thomas. The bond between them deepened, forged in shared loss. And as she grew more comfortable and her command of the language became more fluent, they began to gently question her, hoping to finally understand the mystery of her origins. One evening, with a great fire crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, Father Thomas sat with her. Sir Richard and Lady Alara were nearby, their sewing and account books forgotten as they listened intently. "Agnes," the priest began softly, "can you tell us where you and your brother came from? Can you remember the land you called home?" Agnes fell silent for a long time, her green-tinged face illuminated by the firelight. The vibrant green of her skin had been slowly fading over the months, mellowing into a pale, olive-like hue, but it was still a mark of her otherness. She looked into the flames, as if seeing images in their flickering depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and melodic, filled with a child's simple sincerity and a strange, otherworldly nostalgia. "We came," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "from a land called St. Martin's Land." Father Thomas leaned forward, his quill and parchment ready, though he did not yet touch them, not wanting to break the spell. "St. Martin's Land," he repeated gently. "And what is it like, this land?" A wistful look came into Agnes's eyes. "It is always twilight there," she said. "The sun does not rise as it does here. It does not burn in the sky. We have a light, but it is like the light just before the dawn, or after the sun has gone to sleep behind the hills. A green light. Everything is bathed in a soft, green glow." She paused, remembering. "The people there, we are all green. Like I was, like my brother was. It is the color of life in St. Martin's Land." Sir Richard and Lady Alara exchanged a look of pure wonder, a land of perpetual twilight, inhabited by green people. It was the stuff of myth, of tales told by travelers from distant, imagined lands. Yet here was a child, speaking of it as her home. "And you ate beans there?" Lady Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Agnes nodded. "The beans were our finest food. They grow differently there. They are all we ever knew to eat. The taste of your bread, the taste of your meat. It was a shock, a bitterness we did not understand." "How did you come to be here, my child?" Sir Richard asked, his voice full of a gentle gravity. "How did you travel from this St. Martin's Land to our fields in Woolpit?" This was the part of the story that seemed most difficult for her to explain. She frowned in concentration, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall the sequence of events. "My brother and I, we were tending our father's flock," she said. "In our land, the flocks are not like your sheep. They are different, paler, quieter." She struggled for the right words. "We were in the fields, near a great cavern. We heard a sound, a beautiful, loud sound, like nothing we had ever heard before. "What kind of sound?" Father Thomas prompted. "Bells," she said, her eyes widening at the memory. "A great, chiming, singing sound. It was so loud and so lovely, it seemed to fill our heads." We wanted to find where it came from. We followed the sound into the cavern. The flock followed us, drawn by the music. She described a long, winding journey through the darkness of the cavern, a journey that seemed to have no sense of time. They were not afraid, she explained, because the sound of the bells was a constant, comforting presence ahead of them, pulling them forward. It was a beautiful, hypnotic sound that promised something wonderful. "We walked for a long time," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamlike quality. "The path went down, and then it went up. We could not see, but we could feel the way. And always we heard the bells, louder and louder. And then there was light. But not our light, not the green twilight. It was this light, a bright, painful, golden light." She shuddered slightly at the memory. "We came out of the cavern, and the light was everywhere. It hurt our eyes. And the sound of the bells was deafening. We were frightened. We tried to turn back, to find the path into the darkness again, but we could not. The entrance was gone. We were lost. And the sound of the bells stopped. And then there was only the bright light, and the strange, sharp smells, and the heat of the sun on our skin." She told them how they had wandered, lost and terrified, until they had stumbled into the wolf pit, seeking its shade and shelter from the overwhelming brightness of the world above. There they had stayed, weeping from hunger, fear, and a profound sense of dislocation, until the reapers had found them. Father Thomas sat back, his mind reeling. He looked at the child, her earnest face, the simple, unadorned way she told her impossible story. There was no hint of deceit in her. She was simply recounting her memory, a memory of a world as real to her as Woolpit was to him. "Is there a river in your land, Agnes?" he asked, a thought occurring to him. She nodded. "Yes, a great, wide river. It separates our land from another land, a land that is more brightly lit. We can see it from our hills, but we cannot cross the river. It is too wide and too bright." The priest, Sir Richard, and Lady Alara sat in contemplative silence for a long time that night, the only sound, the crackling of the fire and the sighing of the wind outside. The girl's story answered some questions, but raised 1,000 more. Was St. Martin's Land a real place, hidden deep within the earth? A subterranean world, parallel to their own? Or was it a place of the spirit, a fairy realm from which the children had accidentally strayed? Was the sound of the bells the peal of St. Mary's Church in Woolpit, a sound that had somehow crossed a barrier between worlds and lured them through? They would never know for certain. The story was both an explanation and a deepening of the mystery. It was a tale to be wondered at, not to be solved. The years passed as they do, turning with the steady, reliable rhythm of the seasons. Agnes grew from a girl into a young woman. The last vestiges of green faded from her skin, leaving it with a pale, sallow complexion, as if she had been raised in the shade, but she was otherwise indistinguishable from the other women of the village. She was baptized in the church, a ceremony that seemed to formally sever her ties with her old world and bind her to the new one. She lived at the manor, beloved by Sir Richard and Lady Alara, who treated her as the daughter they never had. She was known for her gentle demeanor and her quiet, thoughtful nature. But sometimes the villagers would see her standing at the edge of the fields at dusk, looking out towards the old wolf pits, a wistful, faraway look in her eyes. They knew she was thinking of her brother and of the soft, green twilight land she called home. Her story became a part of the fabric of Woolpit, a local legend told by firesides on long winter nights. It was a story that stretched the boundaries of the known world, a reminder that God's creation was vaster and more mysterious than they could possibly imagine. It was a tale, not of fear, but of wonder. Agnes eventually married a good man from a nearby town and moved away, building a new life for herself. She was, by all accounts, a fine wife and mother, her life settling into the familiar patterns of work, love, and faith. But it was said that she never lost that hint of otherness, that quiet, contemplative air of someone who held the memory of two different suns in her mind. And in Woolpit, the fields still glowed gold under the autumn sun. The reapers still swung their scythes in a slow, ancient dance. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the church bells of St. Mary's rang out across the land, people would pause in their work and listen. They would listen to the clear, beautiful chimes, and they would think of the two small children, with skin the color of spring leaves, who had heard that same sound from a world away and followed it, out of their gentle twilight and into the bright, bewildering sun. The story left not a scar of fear, but a soft, lingering sense of wonder, a peaceful contemplation of the vast and beautiful mystery that lies just beyond the edges of the familiar world, a mystery as deep and as green as a moss-lined pit in an ancient wood. And as the day would end and the real twilight, the one they knew, would settle over the Suffolk fields, the villagers would feel a sense of peace, knowing their small world was part of a story much larger and more magical than they could ever fully comprehend. The tale of the Green Children became a lullaby for the village itself, a gentle reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, the extraordinary can take root and grow, leaving behind a legacy not of answers, but of beautiful, unanswered questions that soothe the soul and invite the mind to wander, to dream, and to rest.